Well, we had another great week and we finished up Jeremiah, we covered Lamentations, and we started Ezekiel. Let's go back and look at some of the things that we discussed. Episode 183 had us in Jeremiah 28 and 29. Now, Jeremiah 29, probably the most misused verse of the Bible, but remember what's going on here. We see this is the 5th month of the 4th year of King Zedekiah, and we recognize that the people in Jerusalem, who at this point have been in captivity for a total of about 13 years, 12 to 13 years, have another 57 to 58 years to go into captivity in Babylon. But the false prophets among the exiles in Babylon and also among the people in Jerusalem are saying, no, you're only going to be there for 2 more years. So they're saying within 2 years, Nebuchadnezzar's power will be broken and God's going to bring you back to this place. And he is telling them, no, that's not going to happen. We saw down here where the prophets went up to, so the false prophet Hananiah went up to the true prophet Jeremiah, took the wooden yoke that was on his neck and broke it. We had seen earlier, I don't think that we actually covered it in our chapters, but I think it was in Jeremiah chapter 21, 22, where Jeremiah is instructed by God to make a wooden yoke and to wear it whenever he's prophesying to the people to show that they're under the yoke of Babylon. And so the false prophet comes and says, no, he's going to break it off of you and it's going to be okay. And then Jeremiah comes back and prophesies to this guy within 2 months. And he goes, yeah, you broke the wooden yoke, but now God's replaced it with a metal yoke and we're going to be in submission to Babylon and you're not going to see it because you're going to die. And that false prophet dies a couple of months later. And then Jeremiah 29, very, very important to remember that Jeremiah 29 is a letter that Jeremiah wrote to the exiles in Babylon. It's going to get there around the 5th year. The letter that Jeremiah wrote to the people in Babylon is going to get there around the same time that Ezekiel is rising to power as a prophet in Babylon. So Ezekiel starts his ministry as a prophet 5 years into Zedekiah's reign. And that's about the same time that Jeremiah's letter here is going to arrive there. And he's telling the people, look, you need to get comfortable there in Babylon. You're going to be there for a long time, another 57, 58 years. And he goes, and pray for the peace of Babylon because God has left you there for a while. Now, Jeremiah 31 and 32, we see a couple of things. We see that God is prophesying again that he's going to destroy Jerusalem. He's going to bring these people to nothing. And he's not going to leave them that way because what's he going to do? It says one day he's going to make a new covenant with the people, not like the covenant he made with their fathers, but he is going to give them a new covenant. And he says he will put his law within them and write it on their hearts. And no longer will they have to teach people saying, know the Lord, for all of people will know the Lord. All will bow down to him. All will worship him. So this has future references to the cross, all right? This new covenant where people would know who God is and come into relationship with God is future. We see it quoted in Hebrews 7. We see it quoted in Hebrews 10, that this is a reference to the new covenant that was formed in the blood of Christ. So there's an old covenant with the people that God says, I'm going to do away with the old covenant. I'm going to make a new covenant. If you're wondering what the new covenant that he makes is, all you need to do is look at Matthew 26, where Jesus is celebrating the Last Supper with the disciples, and he takes the wine and he says, this is my blood, the blood of the new covenant poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And so Christ, by his blood on the cross, inaugurates the new covenant. And then we come down to chapter 33, and we see a couple of things that, again, here in chapter 33 is the righteous branch mentioned, and that is the branch of Jesus that we saw back in Isaiah 11 and Jeremiah 23. So the next day, for episode 185, we saw the fall of Jerusalem. This was the very end of Jeremiah 51 and 52. But the thing that was significant is Jeremiah 51 is a prophecy about the destruction of Babylon. And he says in there, and it was super cool, or I think it's super cool, the very last 2 verses of Jeremiah 51, he says, when you finish reading this book, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates and say, thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more because of her distress that I'm bringing upon her. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. Now, remember that there's physical Babylon, a physical country, of physical people who have come against the people of God and rebelled against God. But in Revelation, we see spiritual Babylon, specifically Revelation 18. We see that spiritual Babylon, all that opposes God, is finally brought to an end, is brought to nothing. And so the queen of Babylon is destroyed, the city, the nation, the people of Babylon, that is the spiritual oppressive people who are rebelling against God, have finally been destroyed. And we see in Revelation 18:21 that spiritual Babylon, like a rock, the angel takes the rock, casts it into the river, and says, in this same way will Babylon sink to never rise again. So what Jeremiah does here, has his servant do here, in Jeremiah 51:63, we see the angel of the Lord, or an angel of the Lord, doing in Revelation 18, bringing spiritual Babylon to an end, so that spiritual Babylon is finally destroyed and God establishes his kingdom. Now, Jeremiah 40 through 44, this was episode 186. Jeremiah 40 through 44, chronologically speaking, are the last chapters of Jeremiah, even though there's another 8 chapters of Jeremiah, which is really confusing. And it doesn't make a lot of sense as to why it's written in this way. You have to remember that Jeremiah wasn't a book. It's not like it was Jeremiah wrote a book. Jeremiah is recording these things on different scrolls, presumably scrolls of different length, and he's just making notes as he goes along the way. Baruch was his servant. Did Baruch carry the box of scrolls one day and drop them, get them all out of order, or what? Who knows? But Jeremiah ends in Jeremiah 40 through 44. This is after the fall of Jerusalem, and the people come to Jeremiah. Do you remember what they come to him? And they say, look, here we are, talk to the Lord, ask God what we should do, and whatever God tells us to do, that's the thing that we'll do. And they say, if we need to remain in the land, we'll remain in the land. If we need to go to Egypt, we'll go to Egypt. Whatever God tells us to do, we'll do. And Jeremiah tells them, he goes, look, you need to stay in the land. Do not go to Egypt. I know you're scared of the king of Babylon. Stay in the land and God will protect you. But if you go to Egypt, you'll die in Egypt. And what do the people say? The people are so mad, and they said, no, you're not listening to God. You're prophesying a lie. So the people tell Jeremiah, ask God what we should do. Whatever he says to do, we'll do it. But the people had already made up their mind in their own hearts that they were going to Egypt. They were just hoping that God was going to confirm their decision that they've already made. And I think we have a lot of foolish people like that today who have already made up their mind. They've already decided what they want to do, and they seek the counsel, godly counsel. They seek wisdom from God, but they're not going to do what God wants them to do because they've already made up their mind. And they're just as rebellious as these people. So these people ended up rejecting God's counsel, even though they said they wanted God's counsel. They ended up going to Egypt, and then they ended up dying in Egypt. Episode 187 was Lamentations. Isn't this depressing? And I just want to point out, again, chapter 3, that Jeremiah, for the first 20 verses of chapter 3, is talking about how destitute he is, how broken he is, how empty he is, how there's no life, there's no hope, there's no peace. And then in verse 21, he says, but this I call to mind so that I can have hope. I remember the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. I remember that his mercies never come to an end. And he remembers that God himself is his portion. And so when he, in the middle of this destitute, hapless kind of life, he puts his focus back on God. He puts his focus on the steadfast love and the never-ending mercies of God. And that's where he finds hope. And what an incredible encouragement that is for us who find ourselves from time to time in the midst of brokenness. Episode 188, we were introduced to Ezekiel, the young prophet. Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel are how the books fall in the Bible. If you really want to better understand Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Esther, Nehemiah, or Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, if you really want to understand those better, they kind of need to all be shuffled together. So I will try to point out to you along the way, we're not looking at Ezekiel as in depth as we did in Jeremiah, and certainly not as in depth as we did Isaiah, but I will try to point out to you the timeline a little bit of Ezekiel, and I'll write about that a little bit too in the blog as well. But This is when Ezekiel begins. He's 30 years old. He's been in captivity for 5 years. This is the 5th year of the reign of Zedekiah. This is about the time that Jeremiah had written a letter a little bit earlier to the exiles, and it's about the time that the letter of Jeremiah comes to the exiles. And so Jeremiah and Ezekiel are both prophets at the same time. Jeremiah in Jerusalem, he's been a prophet for 34 years. Ezekiel in Babylon, he's been a prophet at this point for a day. God has called him to be a prophet. And he sees the 4 living creatures. He sees a vision of God. And then God tells him, don't be afraid of these people that I'm sending you to. They're rebellious. They've rebelled against me. They've got hard foreheads, but I'm going to make your forehead just as hard as theirs, harder than emery, harder than flint, so that you can speak to this rebellious house. Do whatever I tell you to do. And he says, here are the words that I want you to speak to him. And he gives him a scroll that's sweet in his mouth like honey, but bitter. Well, it doesn't actually say here that it was bitter in his stomach. That's similar, though, to what happens in Revelation with John the Revelator. And so he says, I'm not sending you to foreign people. I'm not sending you to people with crazy speech. They would have listened to you. I'm sending you to my people who are rebellious, who have turned against me. And so remember, when you're reading Ezekiel, I think sometimes what we do with the prophets, most of the prophets are prophesying in or around Jerusalem, or early on, like Elijah and Elisha, they're prophesying in the northern kingdom of Israel, in the city of Samaria, those kinds of things. So, but usually they're in the land of Israel, right? And so Ezekiel is not in the land of Israel, and that's very important. Ezekiel is in the land of Babylon. He's among the exiles in Chaldea, and so keep that in mind when you're reading Ezekiel. And then our last episode this week was episode 189. And this is where God has Ezekiel lay down on his side for 430 days, 390 days on his left side, 40 days on his right side, the first being for the nation of Israel, the second being for the nation of Jerusalem. He's built his little diorama of Jerusalem, has Jerusalem written on the side of a brick, has all the siege works and the ramp works up against the brick. And he has an iron skillet between himself and the city so that he can't see it, symbolizing God has rejected Jerusalem. And he's got all of his food portioned out, laying around him a stack of cow dung over which to cook his food. And God binds him, and not just binds him, but binds his tongue so that he can't speak unless God gives him a word to speak. And it is crazy. And then when those 430 days are done, Ezekiel gets up, shaves his head with a barber's razor, and casts a third of it into the fire. A third of it he chops with a sword, and a third of it he scatters to the wind, symbolic of the people of Jerusalem and the demise that they're going to have. But what does he do? He takes a portion of that hair and folds it into the hem of his garment, symbolizing that God's not done with the people, that he's going to keep them and restore them. And so just a crazy scene here unfolds, but that's not unusual because of, the things that God had other prophets do as well. And so that was our summary for this week. We will continue in Ezekiel. We're still in Ezekiel. If you're joining us for our regular stuff, we'll be in Ezekiel tomorrow. And thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible through another section of Scripture where we come to know and understand God a little bit better. Look, if you're brand new to Simpler Bible, we have all sorts of resources available for you. Go to our website, simplerbible.com, and there you can find these videos, you can find our podcast, you can find links to our social media, and you can even find a blog post with additional scriptures if you want to go into a little bit more study than we had time to cover in this podcast and video today. We hope that this tool will be exactly that for you, a tool. Not something that replaces your daily walk with God, but something that enhances your daily walk with God and helps you to know and enjoy Him more. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll see you again tomorrow.